Peak experiences of any kind shake something up. And I do believe that to truly transform, to truly evolve, to change in a good way, right? In the ways that we want, we have to get shaken up.
What if you turn hardship into greatness, anger into serenity? Everything changes. Make your life a masterpiece. Have you ever wondered what a full-bodied leadership is? Why you ought to embark on the path of full-bodied leadership, and how to actually implement a full-bodied leadership? This and so much more now. Welcome, I'm Yannick, your host, and now joining me, LeeAnn Mallorie. LeeAnn Mallorie is the author of Guts and Grace, a woman's guide to full-bodied leadership. How to lead consciously, dissolve class ceilings, and dismantle the patriarchy within. Welcome, LeeAnn Mallorie, to the show. It's such a pleasure to have you and to discuss your beautifully and impactful book, Guts and Grace.
Thank you so much, Yannick. It's wonderful to be here. I'm excited to dive in with you and your audience today.
Beautiful. So just to start, what if you can introduce yourself only in one powerful sentence? What sentence would it be?
Oh, well, usually I say I help women leaders tap into the wisdom of their body so that they can really lead without burning out. However, I think today the sentence that I would use is I'm kind of a fierce disruptor at a time when the world really needs that.
Absolutely. And I think really disruption is really what helps us grow, right? And this book is really about grow. It's a powerful manual, really, recipe to really change and transform your life and really to enable people to get their tools to really start unleashing their full potential. And therefore, I'm so thrilled really to have you. But first, let's go a little bit back to your childhood. Tell me about your childhood and some of the instances that somehow hinted to the path that you ultimately went about. You started very early already with coaching, leadership, especially really people in the business world. So really give us some taste how your childhood was and the hints that really alluded to your career.
Yeah, thank you for asking. It's funny, for a long time, I've had this thought that I had the most uninteresting childhood, but I think it set me up for a really interesting adulthood. So, briefly, I grew up in the US. I grew up in a small, kind of like a steel mill town in Western Pennsylvania, like a very working class, blue collar kind of town. It was actually probably a town that was in its heyday, a decent sized like place where people were getting an okay education, and then like the rest of the world just took off, and my little town kind of didn't. So I grew up without a lot of access to fancy interesting careers. Pretty much you were like a teacher, like we had a couple of doctors and lawyers, or you worked in the steel mill. And so I really didn't have exposure to big business. I didn't have exposure to the kind of work I do today at all. But my mom actually ran a business, a small business in the town, which was a baton twirling organization. So if you don't know what that is, if you think about like, if you're not in the US and you haven't seen like movies where you see kind of like a marching band and like a woman with a stick who's like throwing it up in the air, that's actually what I grew up doing. It was my athletic practice all from the time I was probably 2 years old until I was about 25. But it'd be kind of like your mom having a dance school, and it was like the only thing to do in town. So all of the little girls and some of the little boys in town were also participating in this. So what I did get to do from really young was to begin to teach, to work with students. When I was probably 13 or 14, I had students who were 5 and 6 that I was teaching movement practice. Did a lot of work in my own body, a lot of kind of body discipline, and then also mindset discipline as part of that, in addition to whatever I was doing in school. And what I found was that I both had a lot of capacity physically, and then I was also, kind of a smart kid. And I got in a lot of trouble. Like I got bullied a lot for the skills and gifts and talents that I had, which in one way probably set me back, and in the other way I think it set me off well, because I didn't really blend to the town that I was living in. I basically was like, okay, if I'm going to like not give up these parts of myself, I'm going to have to kind of be a little self-contained, a little on my own, do things my way. I left that town really as soon as I could, right? I graduated from college and went off to school, and was lucky enough to end up at the University of Michigan, where there was a lot of, well, first of all, there were a lot of diverse people and a lot of access to many different things that I hadn't been exposed to when I was younger. But also, there was a lot of great work at that time going on in terms of personal transformation, in terms of, diversity and inclusion, in terms of various things, even in like the business context or in the school context, that brought me into relationship with a curiosity about personal development and also leadership and leadership development. And sort of long story short, it actually set me on a trajectory where after I graduated, I just knew in my heart that I wanted to do something transformational that had to do with leadership and probably also diversity as well. So I started looking for a job, and there was just nothing available. Like there were lots of little firms that were doing, the constellation of things that I felt like could be for me, given I'd had experiences doing that in school. But I would call these firms and they would basically say, well, it looks like we're a big firm and we have a lot of business, but it's kind of just me and we don't have a lot of clients at this point. So I was pretty early in the wave of doing this kind of work in business. I got lucky. Somebody sent me a referral for a company that was actually a bigger organization doing this work. And so when I was 25, I took a job as, not at that time a coach or a trainer, but I took a job doing 360 feedback interviews, meaning I was the person who would call your boss and your peers and the people who reported to you and all the people around you in the workplace and say, well, how are they doing? How do they need to grow? What are their strengths? These kinds of things. I did that for about a year, and I really got good at unpacking and understanding the psyche of people who were leading. And I got to talk to really interesting, in many cases, very senior level people. So even though I didn't have a background in business at that time, about a year into that job, which I did for 10 years, they invited me to become an executive coach, kind of start out to try it out, to work with some people maybe who are less high risk and then people who are very high risk. And so by the time I was about 26 and a half, I was coaching senior leaders and executives in big companies across the country. That was kind of a boon, but it gave me an opportunity to get my feet wet. And sometimes I joke that because it was almost 20 years ago, we weren't doing video conferences. So you were hearing me on the phone. I was unpacking your soul and helping you figure out how you needed to lead better. And then maybe a few months later, we'd meet at a live event and people would be like, how old are you? Like, how have you been doing this with me? But at that point, we'd already established trust. So um, early life and then early career, this kind of set me up to be able to do the work that I do today.
When you look back, how did you feel at the time when you have, because you're also a woman and oftentimes you're a little bit more self-conscious about yourself and you think like, well, maybe this person actually knows better or more because he or she is older and I'm younger. So how did you navigate this situation at such a young age?
Boy, I think I have a lot of courage, for one, and a certain amount of tenacity. But how I concretely navigated it was that I developed this strategy pretty early on where I would literally say in the first probably 20 minutes of working with a new client, I'm not an expert in business. You know your industry, you know how to do the things that you do. I'm an expert in the human psyche, which I was. I had 2 degrees at that point in psychology. I had basically spent my entire early career learning about human development, human transformation, how those things work. And I was really good at it. So I could see, like that, what was holding somebody back. And so I really, in a way, owned that certain things were not my strength and then leveraged what I knew were my strengths. And that was a pretty quick way to actually build trust with people because they were like, you're right, I do know my business, but I'm having these other problems that seem to be related but unrelated to that. And you seem to be able to help me with it. So I just was really honest and that worked really well.
Yeah, I mean, you also graduated from the University of Pennsylvania, right? And the Masters of also positive psychology, which is very powerful, right?
Yeah.
So
And that was much later, actually. I went back 10 years later to do a master's in positive psychology. So that was kind of an intuition that there was new science. It was time to really rebuild. But I was able to bring that work on top of the work that I had done in my earlier school.
I'm also very curious how you brought the hardship that you felt, because you also mentioned occasionally, when you were younger too, because you were, not as big as others, you were also bullied. How did this somehow empower your health in the future? What would you say? Was it more positives that ultimately contributed to your career and to your growth, or was it probably more things that held you back?
I think both. Um, I work with a lot of women who, for different reasons, don't feel like they're totally getting seen. Maybe they do experience a certain amount of either discrimination or even bullying in the workplace. And I think there's something about really knowing from the inside out the journey it is to work with both your psyche and your mind, but also your physical body to like heal through that type of oppression, that type of receiving. And I can, there's more stories that I can tell, but essentially it's like we pretzel ourselves, we shrink ourselves, we brace ourselves against this kind of experience, whether it's a race related experience, whether it's more an intimate, violence related experience, whether it's actually to do with something more in your community like bullying or all of the above, right? Because some of us have all of the above kind of these experiences. So our bodies are learning how to protect us. And I would say in my own shaping, I would shrink, I would be narrow, and I would stay pretty small. Now, if someone would put me on a stage or put me in front of a client, I could come out because some part of my psyche and my soma had established that that was a safe place to like be myself. But it's just walking down the street or going to like a networking event, for example, there's a lot of pull in that happens in my system. So that has always been working against me, if you will. And it's also been the path that I've gone through to learn how to be able to guide other people to work with their own nervous systems and to work with their own bodies. And in that way, I think it's been a blessing because if I didn't know that territory from the inside out, it would be more challenging to guide others. The last thing I will say is also, I kind of said this earlier, something about it lit a little bit of fire under my butt in terms of being interested in, willing to, fired up to fight for the underdog in some way. And not that all of my clients are underdogs, some of them absolutely are not. However, I would say there's something for me that it does take, some grit and some clarity to be like, no, we're going to change this. Actually, no, something needs to be different. No, how can I empower, people that are inspiring to me, the women that I support, and even the men that I support to stand up for something different. And that's just always been in me, I think, since having those experiences.
But what also struck me when I read the book is you're patient because you actually had the material to publish it much earlier, right? But you didn't. So walk us a little bit through what went through your mind and how really the process unfolded, because it's one thing having the ideas in your head, in your mind, and then actually writing it and bring it down. So walk us through the steps and why you hesitated, whether that's the right word or not, to really publish it earlier than you you did.
That's a great question. If anyone out there is an author or thinking of being an author, you'll relate to this in some way, probably. Um, The book wasn't a good idea. In fact, it wasn't a good idea. It was probably a terrible idea, actually, now that I say that out loud. The book was more like my body was like, you have to do this. And the first do this was actually just writing small sections that were insights about how to practice, as I said earlier, and work with your own body mind system. And it was really my body that was teaching me about that. So many of the things that you'll find in the book, whether they're written this way or not, first were my own stories and my own practice. Sometimes I'll then tell it as a client story because I'm passing that on and I'm doing that work with a client. But ultimately, a lot of it was like, oh, I found from the inside out that this is true. Then I went back and got the science to back it up and so on and so forth. And that was some of the pacing for me was first coming into a relationship with the material, practicing the material, discovering with clients that the material works and creates something, going and looking in, the data and the science and being like, oh yeah, data sort of supports this too. And I say that because there's actually, I would say, a lot of training. There's a lot of work available in the personal development industry. And even if we say like in the fitness industry, for example, I could talk about some of my, movement practice backgrounds that were a good idea. That, it was like, oh, here's an idea of a way we could teach leadership, or here's an idea of a way we could practice something. Let's market it really well. And let's get a lot of people to sign up for it. And like it kind of works. But I would say I'm very proud actually that what Guts and Grace is was sourced through practice from the body up over many years. It's not really how generally we tend to do things. And that's why it works so well. So for me to say I published a book more than 10, maybe almost 15 years after I really wrote it and worked with the material is something that I'm proud of. There's also, reasons why it didn't happen quicker that are more tactical. I didn't feel like I had the right publisher. It wasn't clear if it was meant to be self-published or something that I wanted to try to take to the New York Times. And all of that's just been a journey of listening and trying things on. And maybe like I definitely started to write the book sooner and then put it down for a while and took a pause because I didn't feel like I was ready to finish it. So yeah, I think just being on path and letting something come to fruition in its own time on path is part of my practice and part of what I teach.
Before we really dive into the book, I just want to ask you one more question in terms of business. And for you, really, business is really one of probably the most powerful ways to positively influence the world. So give us a taste what you mean by that, and why do you think business is such a powerful tool to positively impact the world?
My short answer is because everyone's doing business in some way. Even if you're not, you're not in the corporate sector, you're buying things, you're probably also in some way selling something. Um, it, there's two answers really. One is, again, in contrast to some of what I think happens in the personal development industry, and let me say, especially for women, right? That it's almost like we're like, I need to heal. I need to transform myself. So I go outside of the business context. Maybe I go to like yoga or a healing practitioner or a feminine, you know, mystery school or something. And then it's like, and then I go back to work and none of that applies and I don't know how to apply it. So, from a personal transformation perspective, we spend so much time at work, and the workplace is such a big part of what we do that if we're not specifically working the edge of how all of that goodness that we might get in other domains integrates with our leadership, we end up either with a missing piece or we end up with a split psyche. And a lot of the folks that I work with are coming to me because they're ready for integration of those parts. It's like, I have done this healing, but I don't know how this applies to me at work. So that's one answer. Another answer that I have is that at this moment in time, what's happening in business, in industry, including and especially at this moment in time with regards to things like environmental sustainability and how business impacts that, or AI and how we're influencing the development of AI. Like we're moving really big levers in society. And if we're not practicing a certain level of consciousness in those domains, we're on the path of a certain kind of destruction. Let me say it in the positive. If we are practicing a certain kind of consciousness in those domains, we have the potential not only to create wonderful things, but also to keep and maybe to reset humanity on a course for us maintaining a balance with the planet that we live on, with each other. I just think there's a lot that we can impact from business that really only probably big business can pull these levers. Doesn't mean I always work with clients in big business, but I really just I don't think we can, heal or transform without including business.
Yeah, it's so true. I mean, it's really. What aspect of business are you most familiar with and most interested in? Because with your human psychology background, right? What is really, how do you look at business specifically? To what kind of lens? I'm really curious because there is a different lens in my view, especially while reading your book.
What a great question. um, Innovation, but not in the way that you think about it. So I guess if I at this moment in time, most of the folks that I work with that are innovators, whether they're doing this like fully consciously, like they're choosing this on purpose, or whether it's more just what's revealing itself, there's an organic nature to the way that systems develop, unfold, recreate themselves. There's an inspiration that we can take from nature that also we can learn from our own physical bodies, and I'm really interested in how that works. So I'll give you an example. I worked with a woman a couple of years ago, and through her own instincts, intuition, sensing, and then kind of just like tracking, how does energy move, how do organisms move, she and I together in our coaching process had a clarity that there was something for this organization to unfold into, that really it was in a way born to be something almost like you would work with a human, right? That has a soul, so we could say it like that. And so we're tracking this with the organization, and then what the other thing that was happening was that there was another person in the system, who had a certain amount of power, and they weren't open to that evolution. And so it was like the image that we had was that it was almost like it was a flower trying to bloom, or like a rose that was trying to come like very naturally, right? It was going to go through this process. And she was like, great, let's support that process. It'll be good for business. We'll make more money. People, all the things will happen. And it was almost like you would put, a steel ring or some kind of a cinch around a natural organism that then therefore couldn't actually grow. And so that process, as we were witnessing, was a stifling of an organic unfolding. Sometimes we think with business we have to make it do something, but actually it's on its own path to do something. So, really, I believe part of why I'm interested in the feminine in business is because I believe there's a natural tending of something to unfold in its own way that really is how to support business to happen with greater ease. It's just that we have all these, you could say, perversions, or all of these blockers, or all of these things that actually kind of need to get removed for the organism to come into fruition. So I don't know how many people talk about innovation that way. Probably a lot of folks in the environmental sustainability and kind of naturalist fields. So there's a certain lens to that. But why I talk that way as someone who works with the body is because our bodies are designed to know that, to understand, to actually track for that. And when we do enough work on ourselves, in Guts and Grace, they say you become a full bodied leader, meaning you're not just leading from your head, you're actually leading with all of your senses. That takes some time. Like there's a path of practice to actually be able to do that, because we've learned all the ways not to. But if you let yourself come into that kind of relationship, then you have the capacity to be in participation and co-creation with an organization, as if you were gardening, as if you were working with an organism, which it is. An organization is an organism. To be able to create, to be able to tend business in a certain kind of way. Sometimes that means it's an organism that's going to die. And I think that's really interesting right now, because not all organisms will live forever. So that's part of the path of this type of innovation, organic, sort of natural innovation. But this is what I'm fascinated by in business right now. And one of my most one of my greatest joys is when I'm working with a client who has enough power in an organization where she can participate with the organization in tending that and opening up those doors or removing those blocks for the thing to really come into its full aliveness. And it's so beautiful to work that way.
To contextualize it, give us some taste of why specifically woman. Of course, you mentioned it, you touched on it, why you choose specifically addressing women.
Mhm.
But what is specifically that woman face or that blocks them in terms of business? Just give us some context so we can somehow frame the discussion specifically in terms of the woman. What is it that holds them back, or what they most struggle? Because it's very different, obviously. A man, right? There are so different ways. Certain things I just don't really care, right? The way, for example, I look, and I see that in a lot of female friends I have. They really care about the way they look, right? And that's just one thing, right? That's a different reality, for example. And that's not somehow to say anything. It's just that's a fact. It's very interesting because it's a different way of really seeing life, right? There are different priorities that we have. And I think that's what's so beautiful, because that's what really helps us to complement each other perfectly, in my view. So I'm just curious.
Thank you for asking. So, in my book, Guts and Grace, I do choose to speak directly to women, right? The language that I use in the book is focused on women. And as you already mentioned earlier when we were meeting, that anyone can do the practices, that men can benefit from what I teach in Guts and Grace 100%. However, I did choose to focus on women for a couple of reasons. One, where you started to go, that for women in the workplace, there are just many ways that the system hasn't historically empowered them to be in their full expression. There's many ways that that's currently also still so. For example, very simple but very common example, client who has a lot of fierceness. If you're a man, that's probably welcome. People are like, people get excited when their boss is like, and then if you're a woman, it's like you're called certain names, and maybe that's actually a really big part of your superpower. So then there's a certain cultural stifling of the full expression of whatever that is to come into form. So because of that, and because I find that when I work with women in a more closed context, meaning it's all women in the room, more or less, we're more able to grapple with those things and find our way to reckon with them. So I really focus the book directing toward women because of this imbalance that currently exists, and because the particular tools and strategies of internal dismantling of patriarchal threads are, I'm able to be more specific about them when I'm working with women. Now, men in different ways have also been oppressed, perhaps due to race, perhaps due to their sexuality, perhaps due to many things. However, there's a specific kind of pretzeling that we women have learned how to do consciously or unconsciously, and some of us more than others or in different ways than others. It's not a blanket statement, but that there's a number of themes, which are what I teach in Guts and Grace, that are ways we've locked down. And so if we can specifically address them and work with unlocking them in a way that makes sense in a socialized female body, we're able to actually get more leverage. Now, I also have the perspective that something about the superpowers that may be behind that are some of the ones that are less frequently practiced in typical workplace, corporate culture, and so on. And that some of those are actually the ones that we need to be able to innovate in this more holistic way, to be able to have business serve in a good way, in a way that it really could. One of those, I think, is intuition or instinct. And it sounds a little cliche, like a woman has intuition. Everyone has intuition. But there's a way that we may have more of a natural either proclivity toward or capacity to track the field, to know, to feel, to sense what's going on around us, and to care about that and to want to prioritize that. That it gives us a bit of a leg up if we're bringing those skills, if we trust ourselves enough to bring those skills into the workplace. There are other things too, right? But that's just one. And Yeah, and it's felt important to me, like many people are teaching many things about leadership. This is the thing that feels compelling. I actually mentioned right when we started this conversation earlier that I've spent some time recently in ancient Egypt and also ancient Greece. I take a group of women once a year to ancient Greece. And we're really looking at like what are the roles that women and the feminine played in society, like when Western civilization was getting born. And often they were roles that were priestess kind of roles or informant kind of roles or bringing in information kind of roles, advisor kind of roles, in addition to whatever we also still do, which is be part of tending the household and things like that. But there were very specific kinds of initiatory roles that really only women held back in the day in ancient times that just don't really exist anymore. And part of my work, I think, is to revive some of that because, if you have the energy of go do this, make it happen, you also kind of need the energy of for the sake of what and why and how, and like what's the intuition about what's the ripple that that's going to have or the impact that that's going to have in the long term. Those things work really well together. So, like a balance of masculine and feminine energies in business, in society building is super important. And if you look back far enough to where, aspects of who we are now as humans were birthing the societies that we run, that was practiced really commonly. We've just let some of
Have you observed to some extent that it is today, in this day and age, even more difficult for women to really tap into their intuition, let's say? Or how can we understand that in terms of the advancement? Is there some new challenges that you observed, or are they similar, but they're somehow manifest in different ways?
yeah, I think it's more difficult and I think it's changing. In ancient times, at a certain time, far before I can remember, or anyone alive today can remember, there were more rites, initiations. There were more um, organized bodies that were uh, designed to train us, all of us, to work with our instincts, to work with higher levels of consciousness as humans, and go back far enough, and women were really a part of that. And today, I would say, in general, we as humans have trained ourselves out of that being important, and therefore we don't have as much access. It's not as common to like have those practices available to us. I think in some cases they're tucked inside of religion, but then there's the problematicness of do you like this religion or not, or does it fully resonate or not? It's not as available, kind of more mainstream. Um, and so then we have things like workplaces where we spend a lot of our time. Of course, we have religion where we spend a lot of our time. And maybe neither of those is fully tending that part of us. So I think as humans, we not perform to the test, but kind of, right? If it's like, this is what we're being evaluated on, this is what I'm going to develop. And for a woman who comes into the workplace, speaking very, again, broadly, and if you're a woman and don't agree with this, totally fine. But for many women who come into the workplace, it's like, this is what I will be rewarded for. This is what's expected of me. This is the part of myself that I'm encouraged to develop so that I can get ahead, succeed in this context, and so on and so forth. And if that's not my intuition, my instincts, other parts of myself that might be a little less linear, for example, I may not invest in that because it's not what I'm getting rewarded for. It's not what I think is needed. Fast forward 20 years, I'm like, wow, I can't even feel my intuition, or I don't even, in some cases, right, know what I really want or who I really am. It's not uncommon that someone comes to me and is like, by the way, I'm not even really sure I can tell you what I want, because it's been so trained out of me. It's been so trained into me to perform in this way. And so in that way, I do think it's harder for women or for anyone to to utilize, to access these parts of themselves. I also see that there's a trend toward waking these things back up. And so more now even than 10, 20 years ago when I started working with these practices, embodiment is becoming more mainstream. Working with psychedelics is becoming more mainstream. There's a number of different things that are, even doing, let's say, like priestess work. There's more and more schools that are available that are not anything to do with you in business, right? But that are just other places you can go, energy healing work, places you can go to learn to develop those parts of yourself. To come back to where we started, I think part of the problem is that we don't always know how to integrate that into who we are now. And that's the kind of bridge that I've built Guts and Grace to be. Because I think if we're just splitting ourselves in half, either half of humanity is operating outside of the business context, the other half is running the show and running us into the ground, or half of me is operating over here, and the other half is going to work running that show and maybe running me into the ground. So integration, I think, is really key at this time.
What is that made you really realize that we gotta have embodied leadership, especially for women? What was it that your epiphany?
I am not exactly the kind of person who've had like one turning point moment. So I love when someone asks me like a turning point kind of question. I can pick one, and I will. But just to say, it's almost like it's been a number of breadcrumbs along the way, really, or like a few moments of like calibration, recalibration. Early for me um, was that I went through a couple of moments of burnout in my early career. And the first one was pretty dramatic. I was actually living and working in China. It was before I took this job that I described. It actually led me to take the job where I started coaching and doing executive training. But I was teaching English abroad in China and went through kind of a life meltdown that had me have to leave actually and come back to the US. And I really got to see kind of like my own shadow and how intense that it could be. And then I went and got a job and then started to kind of come back up. And in coming back up, I would say I was succeeding again. Like I was a pretty driven, could succeed pretty easily, quickly, like get into something and do well kind of a person. But I started to see a pattern. I started to see like, oh, that thing that I did that like took me down the first time is replicating again here. And I could see that I was going to go down that same route. And at this point, I'm probably 25 or 6 again, 27. But mind you, right, I had spent years and years tracking the human psyche. So I'm observing myself doing the thing that I'm supporting people. And I'm like, okay, this is not good. Like, how do I actually work with this? And funny enough, I just had this instinct that was like, just once a week, I need to do something to tend my body. And it really felt like it was like just once a week. If I do that, that's all I need. It wasn't like that's all I need. It's like that's the next move. It was like a sense of a knowing that came kind of body up. And it turned out that there was a gym across the street, and they had a class that was called Nia Technique, and it happened at like 9:30, I think, which was after I was starting work, right? So at that point, I'm like, okay, I don't know how this works because I'm supposed to be at work, but I have to go to that, and I have to do that on Wednesdays, and I have to do it once a week. And so, here's me kind of a year and a half into my job, going to my big boss and being like, so do you think I could like come in an hour early so I can leave and go to this class and then come back? And they said yes, which no one was doing. So it doesn't sound like a big deal now. Like now, I think 20 years later, we have a lot of, flexibility in schedule and like workplace practices that are supporting individuals to do this kind of thing. At our company at that time, it was unprecedented to do that. So I'm like, okay, that was a good ask, and I got a yes, luckily, right? But it opened this door for me, one, to feel that I could advocate for something that I needed and that it was worth doing, and that it was like something my body needed. So then I started to exercise that a bit more. And then two, it actually introduced me to the body of work Nia technique, which is a very beautiful, also very historically long-standing movement practice that works with the body, mind, and spirit. So you would go do a practice in a gym. It'd be kind of like a fusion fitness dance class. It was actually the first fusion fitness technique that was ever created. So it started an entire movement in the early 80s. But it became a love of mine and just opened a lot of doors to understand how my body was impacting my psyche and how that then played out in who I was being at work. So some of my early lessons came from that body of work, plus another school called the Strozzi Institute, which is a martial arts based embodied leadership school. And when I started to meet these practices, I was like, oh, right, okay. The body, like, not only does the body play a role, but it was very clear to me how I could work with it in my own body and then pass that on to clients, which really was how the whole Guts and Grace was born.
And you also mention in the book, and really it's a good illustration what you're just saying, that really the tiny steps really make the transformation. Please elaborate on why the tiny steps are so pivotal to true transformation.
Because it takes the body a little while to catch up with your good idea of your transformation. Meaning, it's such an important question right now because also with psychedelics becoming really popular, like big peak experiences, whatever, you go to a yoga retreat, you have an epiphany, you sit with ayahuasca, you have an epiphany, whatever the things are that we're doing now. And then it's like, then you have to go home and wash your dishes, and like, really, it might be that washing the dishes is actually the entire step to transformation. That's the next thing on your path. So I'm being a little cheeky, but essentially, practice through the body is how something becomes sustainable, how it gets integrated, how it becomes not just an experience you had or a good idea, but who you are. And I'm not saying that it's impossible that one can have a peak experience and everything be different. It can, especially if that peak experience changes your day to day, moment to moment behavior. So sometimes that happens naturally. I mean, in good and bad ways, right? I'm in a car accident. I almost die. I wake up tomorrow and I'm like, I'm going to be different. And then I am, and I start acting different. And over time, I become a different human. So this happens to us humans, right? I don't have this kind of turning point story. I mentioned that already. One of my teachers, actually, her theme essentially was don't wait for a crisis to change your life. Well, how do you not wait for a crisis to change your life and have that experience? You start taking baby steps now in a direction that is the direction you desire to go. But even if you've had a positive peak experience, let's say you did go and have a psychedelic experience, you kind of hear people say, but integration. What is integration? Integration is I go back to life. I make sense of that in some way. I translate that into new behavior. I walk the path of that new behavior for long enough that it becomes natural. People say it takes 21 days. People say it takes 30 days. It takes 90 days. It just depends on what you're working with. But we do have to give our bodies time and practice to catch up. And one of the reasons is that everything that we do by default, by habit, was designed to protect us in some way, to promote us in some way, to get us something. It's got benefits to what it's been doing. And so we have to actually train ourselves to trust that the new habit, the new thing, will work. It won't blow us up. It won't take us down the wrong path, right? If I'm going slow, I have a client, one of my early stories I like to tell is that I had a client who was super hard charging, was trying to get from like, senior vice president to like executive level in her organization, which is in the financial sector. And we established that what she needed to do next was walk more slowly from her car to her office every day, once a day. That was her practice. She was like, I can't do that. That's not me. It's like everything that I've been built to do is go fast, get shit done, all the things. And 3 days into doing that practice, she was like, something's changing. And it's not that people notice that I'm walking slower. Nobody's noticing that at all. I'm feeling uncomfortable, but people are like, I think you're more accessible this week. It's nice to see. Like, there's like this something changing that through practice began to change over time. So practice is everything. And it's what we don't want to do. It's like, it's great to have an awakening, but who wants to go home and wash the dishes? But if we don't, then we don't really get to keep the ground we've gained. And on the
E-
positive side, if we do, we get to keep the ground we've gained and we build.
Everyone who is listening now, go on Conscious Capitalism Press and order a copy of Guts and Grace by LeeAnn Mallorie. It's an outstanding book, and what I really love is there are 12 steps that truly can transform and unleash your untapped potential. And you know what I also love is like it feels like every new chapter feels like a new book because you're such a outstanding and thorough writer. I have to say, and I can't wait to when I'm back in Quebec, in northern Quebec, to get up in the morning and read every day one chapter, or at least every month, and really go through it, take a lot of notes, because that's where really transformation comes in. So it's outstanding. So let's go back to psychedelics. That's also very interesting. And in terms
Before
of
we do,
build,
Yannick, I'll just say you can also get the book on Amazon, unfortunately or
of
fortunately. So
course, yeah.
anywhere you'd like to order it, you're welcome to get it.
Anywhere, we will put the link anyways below. No, that's for sure, you will get it anywhere. It's really powerful book. There are not that many self-help book or self-transformation or personal development book that are as powerful as your book, I have to say. Really, I find it really applicable, powerful book, so everyone really who is listening. So let's just go quickly back, because you mentioned also in terms of course, building new habits and how important it is to start slow and to get going. Now, I just want to go back what you have said in terms of peak moments. There are positive and negative peak moments, right? And both can change your life to the positive or negative. Now, unpack why you think the positive or potentially the negative might be even more helpful for positive personal transformation, if there is at all a difference.
Hmm. Interesting question. Yeah. Um, Peak experiences of any kind shake something up. And I do believe that to truly transform, to truly evolve, to change in a good way, right? In the ways that we want, we have to get shaken up. We can opt into getting shaken up to come back to where we were a minute ago, right? By sitting with psychedelics or by having a different kind of peak experience, by climbing Mount Kilimanjaro or whatever your thing is. Um, we can also get shaken up by something falling apart. I have a couple of clients who come to me after losing a job, for example, and maybe like losing a job in a not so awesome, pretty dramatic kind of way. And these experiences are enough to unhook us from our certainty or the amount that we cling to a particular identity, that we have to reach for something new, or we have to be open at least to something new. And that is helpful when we've been on a path, and let's say we're in a plateau in some way, or let's say we've been for a period of time kind of replicating the same old thing that either we know isn't working or we've kind of felt is working, but some part of it's not really working, right? So I can't say that I recommend or don't recommend a peak experience. I can say that if you've had one that hasn't been positive, there's a silver lining, which is you may be more open or more ready for the next iteration of yourself, your soul, your full self expression, like who you actually are, to come online. And some of my teachers, it's a little heavy handed, but some of my teachers would say they believe like those kinds of experiences are almost like a redirect from the universe. Like, okay, like Wake Up Call. Actually, Wake Up Call was one of the working titles of the book that eventually became Guts and Grace. Um, but there was something about this, like, pay attention and like be willing to let something go, that's just not easy for us as humans. And so these experiences, when we have them, they put us into a more raw state where we may be more willing to let something go. On the positive side, I think you can say, similarly, there are more people, we said, right, working with psychedelics, maybe going to the jungle, having experiences, and it's like, oh, what I thought was so isn't so, or like there's some disillusion that happens. It's like an identity disillusion, and that's terrifying. But also, that allows for the possibility of a new identity, or maybe a more refined or more polished or more authentic version of an identity to come forward. And I think we as humans are actually built for that. I think we're born to have the capacity to almost reinvent ourselves in these ways. And I guess I'll just say, at a societal level, if you look at what's happening, right now in the United States or in different places where there's war, it's tragic. And also, we will have to keep reinventing ourselves from that. And there may be a silver lining in that, actually. Like maybe there's part of that we get to grow out of. So we recently did a summit in Costa Rica, and many of the folks who came, actually, because we offered a scholarship, were women who'd been working in careers in foreign aid and DEI and some of the things that have gotten cut recently in the US, which are, you know, things that I care a lot about. And so we decided to open up our event to people who had gone through job loss and things in that domain. And yeah, it's really just, it's beautiful to see the amount of like grief of the loss, and then also underneath that the reinvention that's starting to happen. And when hope starts to come back online, it's like, well, now what do I do? Now who am I? Now what am I becoming? And then that kicks off a path of travel, a path of curiosity. I know you mentioned you're going to walk the Camino, and these kinds of things can also be what kick us off into a path, a new path for ourselves, literally. So this is what I think about it.
Just as an aside, have you read, because it sounds a lot of Carl Jung, what you're talking about, also in terms of transformation, how much present was he during your studies? You did a lot of studies also at the University of Pennsylvania.
Yeah, almost not at all. I've almost on purpose avoided his work, not for any reason that I'm like against his work at all. Um, I've mostly really worked body up, but I think that it's fascinating and not surprising, right? That in a way, we're all in our own ways tapping into some kind of collective experience, collective consciousness. And so I didn't get there through reading someone else's books. I got there through my own practice. And I think many of my teachers are the same. But that's the good news, is that anyone can also get there in a way through their own direct experience and their own practice. And that's kind of what I'm a stand for, right? Even Guts and Grace, I'm like, try this or don't. Try the thing that calls to you, that like this inspires you to try. And so I think the more we can find our own way from our own bodies up, from our own hearts up, we're gonna find similar things, because we're all human.
I think what's also very important, and you mentioned psychedelics, and I also have friends actually who tried it out and it went badly, so there's always two sides, right? And also, as Carl Jung also argues, there isn't any positive, there is also a negative, and vice versa. That's just life, right? It's all about how you ultimately go about it. So just tell me a little bit, if you don't mind, have you ever had an experience in terms of psychedelics, something like that? And what are some of the pointers that you would say, okay, well, if you're really curious, if you want to really do it, absolutely go ahead, or this one, okay, if you're at this or that stage, you better be careful. So, what are some of the indicators that help people to decipher in which direction they ought to go?
I'm taking a breath, because I'm aware that however I answer this question has weight, right? That people are curious right now, that there's um, people are in process of trying things right now. I'll say a few things. Um, One perspective is that there's no such thing as a bad trip. And if I say that, what I mean by that is, if you have a terrible psychedelic experience, it probably still shakes something up, opens a door for you, and what you do next matters a lot. So if you're listening and this is you, um, who are the next people you get support from? What are the next conversations that you have? What does it lead you to never want to do again, or to do again in a different way? What did you get to see that was terrifying to face, but that might also be important? And so I'm speaking from experience. I have spent a decent amount of time with psychedelics. And actually, at this moment, I have a regular practice that I've come to through some quote unquote bad experiences. Um, One of them, was something where I was like, wow, I don't know if I ever want to do that again. That was terrifying. That was hard. And in time with digestion, it has shown me parts of myself that were actually superpowers that I didn't know how to use. And so, but that took a few years to get to that. So I will say, like, it's definitely important that you have someone tracking you, that you're working, if you're doing any of this type of work, in a community where you feel safe. Or if you didn't, then find a safe community that you feel like you can get support from to integrate. That could be anything from your therapist to, a local organization that does this type of work, to anything in between. It doesn't, your acupuncturist, it doesn't have to be anyone related to psychedelics at all. But it's like, you know, mostly I would say only do something if you really feel called. Never do something under peer pressure or because of a should or anything like that. And then kind of know who you're. There's this expression like spelunking, like, there's like, you go into the cave and then you have somebody up top holding the rope for you, or like who's tracking you when you go in. So have those people that are tracking you can be a really good practice. Um, what's interesting in my world right now is that I've been in a practice with a community that recently received legal status in the United States. And it's a very big deal, actually, right now. There's been a big case that we have won. And so it's becoming a much more both out and deep part of my practice. And for many, many, many years, I wasn't the least bit interested because I got everything I needed from embodiment and the work of the body. It's just about pace. It's like we can find our way to all of these places through meditation, through our sexuality, through embodiment practice, through energy work, through psychedelics. I believe personally that some of the more native plant medicines have come on stronger right now because, in a way, those spirits, the spirits of those plants, are tracking us. And they're like, humans are in some trouble. We may need to speed things up a little bit here, like maybe even faster than would be ideal. So, in a way, I think that's a good thing. And then, of course, we have to, like, our consciousnesses are going to get shaken up by that, and we have to, like, respond and calibrate. But the folks that I receive and learn from come from indigenous lines, are not all themselves from indigenous lines, but we're like, yeah, you know, this will be useful for humanity to raise our consciousness right now. So if we can make it more accessible and help it happen at the pace it needs to happen to keep humanity on track, we'll do that.
What do you think are some of the tools that you have to acquire in order to decipher, to know when enough is enough? So we go a little bit into the tools of the book, right? And I think that's some of the difficulties, that it takes a lot of work and you actually show how to do so. So walk us through of some of your steps of tools that you present in the book, specifically in terms of knowing when enough is enough.
Hmm. I don't have a quick answer to that right now. um, all I can say at this moment, and there are probably some specific tools in a specific context that are in the book, but all I can say at this moment is because of the domain that we're in, that what you like, as much as you can integrate, right? Um, if you're receiving something, consuming something, having experiences that are more than you can handle, more than you can translate back into your life in some way, then it's probably too much. Time to slow down. And really, the same is true in everything, right? If we're talking about how much work that I do, if I'm doing more work than I can actually keep up with. I had a moment not too long ago, actually, because I'm still a student and still in learning with one of the women who works in my business. And I was like, wow, suddenly she's dropping a lot of balls. And I was like, I'm going too fast. And that felt really, really real. Like, oh, okay. I can see that things are falling apart a little bit here. My organization can't juggle this way. I need to repace, recalibrate myself. So that's one way to know.
What's the number one tool you would recommend if you have somehow a lack of purpose or meaning in your life, right? It can be, as you have a lot encountered, people who are very successful, have really climbed the ladder, but they still feel empty. What are some of the tools that you will recommend?
It's going to sound so simple, but in chapter 3 of Guts and Grace, I talk about saying yes and saying no. And the thing is, most of the tools I teach in Guts and Grace are like, they are like acupuncture needles, meaning they're very simple, but not always easy to do disruptors. And what I found is that if a woman or any leader comes to me and they feel like they're off purpose, they're lacking meaning, there's probably a not fully developed or broken relationship that they have with their own yes and no, because they're off track in some way. And so literally simple things like, do you want to eat this for dinner? No. Seems like a very small door, but then it's like, do you want to be working in this company? No. Or yes, but not in this role, right? And so there's a rehabilitation of relationship with desire that is like body up listening. Okay, my gut actually is like, I want to eat a hamburger, not a salad right now, but I'm a vegan. That's a problem. Okay, but maybe there's something going on where, who knows, right? It's a terrible example. People will hate me for that example, um, but uh, that can happen. And so it's a very small hinge, but it can be a very big door to open to work with your own body instincts to say yes to things that are actually true.
And it takes practice. And I think the simplest things are the most difficult because simplicity takes an incredible amount of work. And even though it sounds simple, it's not actually in practice in the sense that, and I'm curious what you think about that, because right now, generally, there is so much complexity, and to simplify things is actually the very art and science of really truly living to some extent. So why do you think it is not as easy to simplify as we sometimes think? For example, if I read, for example, your book, you read it and say, wow, it's so simple. She writes with such a clarity, but that's precisely what's happening is if the very best do something, it always looks easy, right? If you look at the very best footballer, the very best soccer players, the very best hockey player, it looks so easy, but it takes an incredible amount of work to actually make things look easy. So please unpack this. Why is it that it's so hard to simplify?
Because your ego wants you to do everything but the one practice that will change your life. I actually have a client who is in media, and she and I have a lot of conversations about this. She's also a dear friend. It's like there's so much information out there, but how much of it is actually what you need to know? And there's so many different things you could practice. There's so many different possible tools available. The ego's way is to talk you into going to look for other options, other answers, other solutions, and not just do what I suggested, which is practice saying a real yes and a real no. Because all of those other things are also interesting. But when you do all of those other things, You don't actually crack the thing open you're trying to crack open. And that is really by design. I think it's not a coincidence that we are in a society, we built a society where there's so many choices available. And when we're not finding the choices that really heal us, that really transform us. And so I think what you're presencing is really wise, actually. And it is why the book Guts and Grace is designed that way. When I teach Guts and Grace, we spend 1 month on each practice, a whole month. All you have to do is practice saying real yeses and real nos. Things change because there's
They
no running
absolutely,
away. It's
they
like,
absolutely
that's
do.
the
You're
thing. Are you ready to
such.
do that? And feel your body, and feel your body, and feel your body. That's all. Thanks for asking.
What does your media consumption look like?
Do you want my honest answer or my less honest? Okay. My real answer is almost zero. And if you're reading my posts on social media, my assistant is probably putting them up there. It's not always in the most service of my business, but I consume very little media. I do have friends, informants, people around me mostly that give me information about big world events because it's important for the space I hold to know that something melted down somewhere around me or something wonderful happened somewhere around me in our country in particular. But to do the level of work and the focus that I do and the way that I hold people and hold space, I mostly don't consume media.
And it's
Not that I expect
obvious.
that of anyone else. It's just my own practice.
What is it specifically that you think is important for you that you really you don't use media almost zero? What is it that is problematic for you in terms of your practice? Because it's important. I mean, I can tell your clarity because that really comes through the book. Because to have this amount of clarity, it really takes practice, it takes focus, right? But if you are constantly out there in the media, it really distracts your focus. So unpack this a little bit.
Yeah, it's really it's a combination of the learning that I've been in about focus, about presence. As I mentioned, I really do make a point to either research or listen or like have folks that inform me about important things that are happening in the world that are impacting the people that I serve. So in that way, I'm like, I want to know what's happening. But if it's not something that I can specifically influence, I just need to know that it's happening. And anything more than that is time away from my own center, time away from my own ground. My personal build, and this is my own Achilles heel, is that I can get deeply lost in emotions, my own and other people's. That's part of my what I've had to work on over the course of my life and my career. It actually makes me incredibly good at what I do because I can sense and track a field. But to be able to operate from my center and clear, I have to have a lot of filters on as well. So that's just been a lifelong learning practice. And thanks for reflecting that and witnessing that in me.
What if anyone who is listening is really dissecting and integrate your book? What will change in their lives?
I hope that it leads to them trusting themselves more, first of all, which I also hope and intend will lead to a promotion, making more money, a better job, more purpose at work, these kinds of things. But first and foremost, that you really build a relationship with your own body, your own instincts, that you feel less crazy. Because I think a lot of our system is designed to have us feel like we don't know who we are, or we don't know what's happening, and this kind of a thing. So that's what I intend.
What makes you feel truly alive?
I have a very quick answer for that. I've always had a very joyful relationship with physical movement, especially dance, especially if no one's telling me how it needs to look or steps or that. And I really love salsa dancing. So either I'm, being led in a beautiful experience that does involve steps, or I'm just in my own practice of dancing. It brings me a lot of joy.
LeeAnn Mallorie, thank you so much for truly being a blessing to myself and really to the world, and for taking the time and being on the show.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. I really appreciate how you interview and what you see.
LeeAnn Mallorie. That's why knowledge matters. Make your life a masterpiece. Visit now programs.d-ykm.com. Meant to make you grow.